So I like Stoicism a lot, and one of the things that I'll sometimes do is just go into the YouTube search bar, type in Stoicism, and see what I get. And lately, a lot of the content that I've seen has been like this. It's basically AI-generated musclemen trying to give you motivational advice. And when I see that, I just think, that doesn't look a lot like the Stoicism that I've read about in books. If you read books like Marcus Aurelius' Meditations or older Stoic texts from the Greek world, you'll see that Stoicism is weird. It has strange views about God and logic, matter, the nature of the mind, what a good life is. And boiling it down to just a couple of inspirational quotes just really doesn't do it justice. So that's why I wanted to make this video. This is an in-depth explanation of Stoicism. By the end of the video, I want you to be able to answer questions like, what is Stoicism? What is Stoic physics, logic, and ethics? What is the Stoic sage? And why has Stoicism remained relevant for thousands of years? I'm Jared Henderson, I'm a philosopher, and if you like this video or you like other videos that I've made, I want to ask you to consider supporting me over on Substack. That helps me make videos and bring in-depth philosophy content to YouTube, and you also get some writing in exchange. I think it's a pretty good deal. So first we need to start with a little bit of history. You might think that the history of Stoicism begins with Marcus Aurelius. It's not uncommon even to hear Marcus Aurelius referred to as a pioneer of Stoic philosophy. But you have to understand that Marcus Aurelius actually comes very, very late in the development of ancient Stoicism. In order to really tell the story of Stoicism, you have to go to ancient Greece. And I would say that you actually need to go back to Socrates. Socrates was a Greek philosopher who lived in Athens. While Socrates himself did not found a school, many of the people who were influenced by him did. This is how you have Plato's Academy, or the Peripatetics, who were the followers of Aristotle, or the Epicureans, or the Cynics, or the different kinds of skeptics, or the Stoics. Each of these schools of thought had its own kind of flavor, but they all inherited a way of thinking about philosophy from Socrates, which was that philosophy was in service of helping you to live a better life. In fact, the ancient Greeks were kind of obsessed with this idea of determining what the best human life was. They viewed all of philosophy and learning, so physics and logic and ethics, all of it was part of this larger project of human flourishing. And in this regard, at least, the Stoics are just a typical normal example. So the founder of Stoicism was Zeno of Citium, and almost everything that we know about Zeno of Citium comes from this book. This is the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers by the ancient historian Diogenes Laertius. So in that text, we actually learn a few interesting things about Zeno of Citium. He was very interested in figuring out how to live the best possible life, and one of the ways that he tried to make some progress on that was by visiting the Oracle of Delphi. This is also how the story of Socrates begins. Zeno asked the Oracle how he could live the best possible life, and the Oracle told him that he needed to take on the complexion of the dead. And Zeno interpreted this as meaning that he needed to make his mind more like ancient authors, and so he needed to read and study them. Zeno eventually goes to Athens. He's looking for a philosophical teacher like Socrates, but the only problem that he has is that Socrates has been dead for quite a while. But Zeno did find a teacher. That was the Cynic philosopher Crates. We're not going to go in depth about Cynic philosophy. It's just helpful to note that in a lot of practical ways, Cynic philosophy and Stoicism actually have a lot in common. It's just that the Cynics tend to be significantly more intense about things. For instance, the Stoics would go on to say that it's fine to be wealthy, but that wealth, strictly speaking, doesn't matter. The Cynics might openly advocate for just being poor on purpose. The Cynics also really didn't care about social convention, and in fact, the name Cynic actually comes from the Greek word for dog, which was kind of meant as an insult that they later took on as just a name for themselves. So Zeno doesn't only study with Cynics, though. Eventually he studies with people who have been influenced by Aristotle and by Plato as well. And it's only after that that he goes on and founds his own school. And he started to teach at a place called the Painted Porch. And this is actually where we get the name Stoicism. The Greek word for porch is stoa. So the Stoics are basically like the people who meet at the porch. They're porch people. It would be really great here to talk about some of Zeno's writings. The truth is, we don't have any. And this is true for many early Stoics. Much of their work is just completely lost to history. This includes the second head of the Stoa, Cleanthes. We only have one text by him. And then the third head, who's considered to be possibly the most foundational and important Stoic, Chrysippus, we only have fragments from him. But from other ancient summaries and accounts of Stoicism, we know that Chrysippus played an important role in systematizing Stoicism, turning it into a complete and comprehensive system that you could study as a whole. Chrysippus basically took Stoicism, which previously had been maybe some disconnected, but very interesting and related teachings, and tried to turn it into a philosophy that was about life and the universe and everything. Now, the Stoa continued after Chrysippus, and in fact, there would be many other heads of the school and many other Stoic writers. But typically when people say the Stoics believed, they're often referring to Chrysippus's systemization of the earlier teachings from people like Zeno and Cleanthes. Sometimes we talk about a group called the Middle Stoics. This would be other Greek Stoics like Antipater or Posidonius. Some of these Stoics would actually make significant changes to the ideas of Stoic philosophy. The philosophy would continue to spread through the Greek world and then the Roman world, and that leads to a group of writers that we sometimes call the Roman Stoics. These are people like Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Cicero to some extent, and Seneca. We'll get back to the Roman Stoics after we've talked a little bit about what the Stoics really believed. For the Stoics, philosophy could actually be broken up into 3 components. That's physics, logic, and ethics. Now, different Stoics actually disagree about which should come first, the logic or the physics, but ethics was usually seen as the culmination of Stoic philosophy and would be presented last. All of these terms are meant to be used pretty broadly. Like, physics isn't just about what you would study in a physics class, but it's also about things like whether or not God exists and what God is like. Logic is also understood pretty broadly, so it's not just the formal analysis of arguments like we would use it now, but it was also the study of good reasoning and what we would typically call epistemology, the study of knowledge and wondering if knowledge was even possible. And then ethics is basically how to live a good life in light of what we know about the world and about logic. The Stoics viewed philosophy as a kind of field. Around that field is logic. The land and the trees in the field are physics, and the fruit of the trees, it's ethics. All of Stoic philosophy really is leading up to those ethical questions, which I think, by the way, is why so many people look to Stoicism just for practical advice. It's what the Stoics really thought we should be aiming for. It's just that currently modern readers like to skip a couple of steps and go straight to the ethics and not worry about the physics or the logic. We're going to follow the example of those early Stoics, and we are going to talk about physics, logic, and then ethics. Oh, hold on. I need to see who's at the door. Hey, Jared, just so you know, Delete Me is sponsoring this video. All right, that's good to know. Do I know you? No, but I know you. How'd you find my address? It's on the internet. You see, data brokers take all of your information and then they sell it, and people can use that to steal your identity or to discriminate against you when you're applying for jobs. Or to show up at your house. Exactly. But if you use Delete Me, they can help you remove all of that information from the internet. So how does this work? All you have to do is set up your account with Delete Me. You give them some information, and then their experts get to work, and they're going to start removing your information from the internet. They'll find and remove your personal information from hundreds of websites. Like my address. And your name, your phone number, your relatives, your social media, all that kind of stuff. And they don't just do it once. They'll keep scanning for an entire year. I do like that. I knew you would, and I think your audience would too, so I just need you to read this. Get 20% off Delete Me US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Henderson and use promo code Henderson at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/Henderson, code Henderson. Hey, that's a pretty good deal. And now, in all seriousness, I use Delete Me to keep my private information off of the internet, and I think you should too. So go to joindeleteme.com/Henderson, use the code Henderson at checkout, and you can get 20% off a US consumer plan. Now we're going to get back to talking about Stoic physics. Stoic physics is often described as materialist, though some scholars prefer the name corporealist, because Stoics believe that everything that truly exists has a body. If you know how philosophers talk about metaphysics today, you might think the view that everything that exists has a body would mean that the Stoics don't believe in souls, or in God, or in anything that we would consider to be kind of immaterial. But that's not quite right. The Stoics believe that God exists, for instance. It's just that God has a body. There are souls, but souls have bodies. Even wisdom itself, something that the Stoics seek, has a kind of body. Stoic metaphysics in this way is just really kind of weird. Now, the Stoics also believe that there's a thing called subsistence, which differs from existence. And this lets you talk about a different class of entities that don't really exist, but we still kind of need them as we build our theories of the world. This would be things like time or void, which is kind of like space. These are said to subsist, but not exist. When Stoics would do a kind of analysis of language, they would rely on something called lecta. And lecta are a lot like what we take to be propositions nowadays in contemporary philosophy of language or philosophy of mind. Lecta also only subsist rather than exist. The distinction between existence and subsistence is vexed. In fact, I would say a lot of contemporary philosophers would say that it's meaningless, or you can't even make coherent sense out of it, or even if you can make coherent sense out of it, it's pointless. You just don't need it in any serious philosophical theorizing. If you're interested in learning anything about this stuff, I'm just going to point you down below to what I think is a pretty comprehensive list of resources for you to go and learn more about Stoic philosophy on your own. Other parts of Stoic physics look pretty common for the period. For instance, thinking that the world is made up of 4 main elements, those 4 elements being fire, water, earth, and air. But more distinctively, the Stoics believe that all of reality was made up of 2 principles, the active principle and the passive principle. The active principle, which is also identified with God, sort of acts upon the passive principle. And the passive principle is really the primordial stuff out of which objects or things in the world are made. But the active principle doesn't just act on the passive principle. The active principle acts through something else, which is called pneuma. That comes from the Greek word for breath. This is what makes objects, endows them with certain properties. Differences between types of creatures is described in terms of differences in pneuma, sometimes talking about the tensility of pneuma. The Stoics didn't just say that the active principle was identified with God. They would also describe what God is like. Sometimes the active principle was identified with Zeus. You see this, for instance, in a text that we have from Cleanthes called a hymn to Zeus. We'll talk about that hymn a little bit later. The active principle, though, was also sometimes identified with the logos, which is the Greek word for, well, basically word. In Greek philosophy, logos is something like a technical term, and it can often mean something like a rational structure or principle behind the world. If you're familiar at all with the Bible, you'll actually see this in the Gospel of John if you look in the Greek there. So at the very beginning of the Gospel of John, it says, "In the beginning was the Word." That word there is logos. John the Evangelist is actually using terms from earlier Greek philosophy to then try and describe Jesus Christ. And in this way, you actually see some parallels between the Stoic conception of the universe and the early Christian conception of the universe. But Christians also say that the Logos is like a person, the divine person, and that is not the Stoic view. God might be better understood as a kind of life force that goes through the universe. And this life force actually dictates everything down to the smallest detail. So the Stoics were actually very deterministic about the universe. Everything that would happen in the universe was sort of planned out and was being guaranteed by God. And this includes what's going to happen to the universe eventually. For the Stoics, the universe goes through periods of order. We're in a period of order right now. And then periods of disorder are kind of a conflagration in which the entire universe is actually consumed by fire. And then it repeats. It's not always clear if these cycles are supposed to be strictly the same. So I don't know if in the next Stoic cycle, there will be someone who is identical to me making a video that is identical to this, and that someone who is identical to you will be watching the video. But it could be. Or it might be that the cycles are similar but not strictly the same. I was trying to think of a good way to illustrate this, and unfortunately the best example I can think of is like this fantasy series, The Wheel of Time, which you might know I'm a big fan of. It's just basically common knowledge in those books that the world is going to go through cycles, and that people will be reborn, but they're not going to do the exact same things. They're highly similar cycles, but they're not always the same. Really, the key point for Stoic physics are that everything that exists has a body, and bodies really are the things that can be affected causally. The active principle is the thing that kind of makes objects into what they are by acting on the passive principle, and that's either God or Zeus. And the active principle also ensures kind of highly deterministic universe that will go through cycles of destruction and rebirth. Later Stoics like Epictetus will talk about the metaphysics of Stoicism, but they often don't take the time to defend it. They almost take Stoic metaphysics as obvious. They're just assuming it. There's a section in Epictetus's discourses where he talks about providence and how he's just admiring the fact that Zeus basically takes care of all of us. And he thinks that a rational person is just going to be grateful for the kind of care that Zeus has shown. This doesn't strike many of us as obvious, but it's just how the Stoics, even the later Roman Stoics, thought. When we talk about logic now, we often want to just say that we're studying arguments, seeing whether or not arguments are